Hi, and welcome to another Literacy Ready course training refresher. This refresher focuses on English Unit 1, Lesson 7, and particularly focuses on preparing for and helping students make the presentation in Lesson 7. So in Activity 5 of Lesson 7, English Unit 1, students are going to be using the draft that they have written of a synthesis essay to make a presentation to the class. And the presentation will focus on the thesis statement for their synthesis essay and relevant evidence. There's been a lot of work going on prior to this activity that students will be drawing from to make their presentation. Prior to this activity, you and your students have revisited the assignment prompt and the quotes that students can choose from, as well as the requirements for additional resources. You've revisited the timeline that they developed in Lesson 3 for the essay that they're writing, and you've reviewed material in their academic notebooks for anything that might be included as evidence in their synthesis essay. In addition, you and your students have collected additional resources and information if necessary, written a summary paragraph that includes the thesis statement and the key points, created an outline, and written a draft of the synthesis essay. So at this point, students really have a lot of information. They're pretty ready to go. What this lesson focuses on, or what this activity focuses on, really is getting them some feedback so that they can use that to revise their draft for the final draft of the synthesis essay. So a little bit more about the presentation itself. First of all, the presentation should be bare bones. Each student's presentation should take no more than 3 minutes. And the content of the presentation should be really just the thesis statement and then the specific evidence students have found to support that thesis statement. It's expected that that evidence is going to come from a variety of different sources. They may be the supplemental readings that students have already done in class. They may be other sources that students have found, but the evidence should be there to support their thesis. One thing that's important with this presentation is to try to get the students not to focus on non-essentials. So often they'll be making, say, a PowerPoint presentation or perhaps a Prezi, and there's a huge temptation to focus on the style, the colors, the transitions, other bells and whistles, and it's really important that you cut that off. They shouldn't be spending a whole lot of time trying to make sure that their transition from one slide to the next is artistic enough. It's not really about that. It's really about the content, not the appearance of the presentation. So as students make their presentation, you might think about who they're presenting to. So we recommend that if your class is very small, say 4 to 5 students in the class, then each student would present to that whole class. If your class is large, then you should divide the students up into small groups, no more than 4 to the group, and have your students present to that small group. That will save some time. It also is a little less intimidating than presenting to the whole class. You might think about grouping students by quote. So students might present to others with the same quote. That can be helpful to sort of see what kind of stance different students are taking on that quote. You might also think about grouping them so that each quote is represented if you wanted to get sort of a broader perspective. The interesting thing is that you want students to see that there are different directions that they can go with each quote and with the evidence that they provide. But do keep your groups small, no more than 4. That's partly to save time, because I know that this is a very time-intensive unit, but also to make sure that students are comfortable in their presentations. So as I said before, the focus for this presentation is on the feedback that the students will get as a result of it. So we do recommend that you use the feedback form that's available in the academic notebook as well as in the lesson plans. And then it will probably be helpful as well for the teacher to model helpful versus non-helpful feedback. Won't take a whole lot of time, but what you might do to make that happen is to ask a student to make a presentation, or you can just imagine that a student has made a presentation. use the feedback form, fill it out once with helpful presentation and project that to the class, and then another time with non-helpful information so that students can sort of see the kinds of things we're looking for. So here's a copy of the feedback form. I'm just going to zoom in on this first question. So the first question is, how convincing for you was the evidence presented here? Now, it would be easy for students to say very or not at all, but that I would classify as non-helpful. So you might want to ask them to be more specific. For example, they might say, well, the evidence from Benjamin Franklin's essay was really convincing and matched well with your thesis, whereas the evidence that you pulled from the blog post was not so convincing and didn't connect as well. That kind of thing. So here is another good example of a place where you might model the kind of feedback that you're expecting students to give. And then this question, what could have made it more convincing? So this is a good place to say, the evidence needs to more clearly support your argument, and maybe your argument itself is not as clear as it could be, or I wasn't sure what source your evidence came from, something like that. And then there's this general question, what other advice would you provide to the speaker? And this might just be about the content still, but maybe also about the presentation. Don't shuffle your feet while you talk, or it seems like you're really stretching the evidence that you're presenting and maybe you need better evidence overall, something like that. We have also provided a pretty simple rubric that you can use to assess students' presentation. I'll just zoom in on this a little bit. So there are basically 3 points that we're looking at, and notice again that the content is key. So first of all, the presentation provides a concise and clear summary of main points in the synthesis. No, somewhat, or very. The presentation includes evidence such as quotations with appropriate citation. No, somewhat, or very. And then finally, the presentation style is coherent and effective. No, somewhat, or very. Now, students should be getting plenty of feedback from their peers, but this is another way you can provide feedback, and perhaps anyone that you happen to listen in on, you can complete that feedback form for them as well. In the next lesson, lesson 8, students are going to take the peer feedback that they've gotten on their presentation and the teacher feedback that they've gotten on their rough draft to revise and edit their synthesis essays for the final draft.